So grateful to be here and very happy to discuss these incredibly important and hard to talk about topics. He has an incredible backbone and staggering moral fiber. Howie is totally committed, completely ethical, totally admirable. No pressure if you can hear this, but honestly, Howie's a hero to me.
John, you joined us before, and it was a pretty incredible kind of testimony you gave, and you just devoted your life to advocacy for child trafficking, and even 9/11 truth. Maybe you could explain to us, in the last decade, what do you think the most challenging parts of coming alive on some of these issues have been?
Probably the hardest thing, and it continues, is just realizing that pretty much everything that I was told and taught since I was in grade school is probably not true. Hello, and welcome to the Traffic Report. Howie, how are you?
Doing well, John. How are you?
Pretty good. I'm actually excited and honored that we have a special guest tonight that's going to relate her personal story of child sexual abuse, and she's a survivor, and it's been a pleasure just getting to know V in the past few weeks.
Yeah, we're super fortunate. I've always felt that survivor stories are one of the best tools we have to wake people up, and this will be our second, and hopefully we'll have a lot more. And she has a great story to tell, so I guess we should introduce her.
Yeah, well, I've got a little bit of a biography here that she was so kind to supply.
Well, let's say hi to her. Hi, V.
Okay. Hi, V.
Hi, guys. Thank you so much for having me on, and I, adore both of you, and it's an honor for me to be here with you this evening. So,
well, thank you for doing it.
Absolutely, thank you so much. And so apparently, she's 57 years young. That might be a misprint.
That's fact.
A spiritualist, a follower of Native American lore and tradition, as I am, and I'm really we have some interesting discussions about that. Universal and metaphysical enlightenment, mother of 2 men, and grandmother of a 9-month-old boy. She's a degreed journalist, a licensed social worker, a business owner, and her passion is for awakening others to the truths of our current existence with specific concern for bringing down elite pedophile networks globally. And so, boy, we are on the same team. She rescues animals that have been abused, and she studied with the Monroe Institute. And for the people listening, we have some very good links that are all about recovery from child sexual abuse, and they will be in the show notes. And with that, I give you V.
Well, thank you so much. Again, I feel so honored to be here, and this is certainly a topic that we're being bombarded with, I think, day in and day out. One of the things that I'm always struck by is that growing up, when I was a child, I felt completely alone. And I believed that in the entire universe, I was the only person going through the things that were happening to me.
Yeah.
And so, it's been an enlightenment for me as well throughout my journey to have these things put in my face as to what's happening historically, things that I never knew about, and also what's happening right now in our lifetime, and what we see day in and day out in the non-mainstream media. And I'm very grateful that we have someone in the White House right now who's actually trying to put a dent into what's happening to children. And I have never seen the action that's been taken since President Trump has been in office, as far as the amount of people that are being arrested and brought up on charges. And that gives me a lot of hope that we're moving in the right direction.
Us too, and as you know, because we talk a lot, and I just want to thank you, at the outset, the information that you provide, the expertise that you have is just invaluable, and sharing your story, and that's such a goal, with I think everybody that works in this area, is to let people know that they're not alone. This is not just happening to them. There's help out there. There's recovery from this. And it's just such an important message. So all the stuff that you do, to assist us and what we do, I want to thank you right off the bat for that. But yeah, the only president that's written an executive order on child trafficking in the history of the United States. I mean, that's
yes. He's
awesome.
He's definitely a hero to me, and I have been following his career for over 30 years, and I always, in my heart, hoped that every time he said he would run for president, I always hoped that he would actually do it. And part of me thought, well, it probably will never happen, because truly becoming president of the United States is not something that most people probably want to take on. But I'm so grateful that he's in that position, and I think he's exactly where he needs to be. And I just hope and pray that over his administration, I hope it continues for another 4 years, that we continue to see an awareness in our country as well as globally as to what's happening to children, really in every corner of the world. And we may be in the United States, and we every day we talk about what's happening to children in third world countries as well as developed nations like our own, but the torture and the depravity that's happening is the same universally. We're human beings, and when this evil takes over and it strips a child of literally their heart and soul, that I believe is probably quite universal as far as what it does to a human being.
Yeah, and I'm just struck. I'm looking at your pictures, some of your pictures, and that the eyes are the windows of the soul, and I'm happy to see that light still shines, and what struck me too as I was noticing that was probably the first case that we did when we started the show was Adrian, and you could see that the light had gone out in that child, and there are so many that haven't been able to recover, but to avail themselves of the chance to recover, and my thoughts are with them too. But what a wonderful picture that you supplied, both as a child and now, and I can see anyway that light is shining bright, and that's a good feeling.
Certainly it's a journey, and I think it's poetic justice that we're called survivors, because it is about surviving. And I can tell you as a child, there was many a time that thinking about living to adulthood was not something I could even fathom. I totally believe that I would not survive my circumstances, especially when I was very young. The one photograph that I had provided you with from my childhood, I was actually 3 years old, and that was at the wedding of my mother and her second husband. And I had so much hope for, having a family unit, and we were going to be, a mother, father, and child. And I just, in my mind as a child, it was like this storybook situation that we were going to be living. And it ended up from that moment on, from the actual marriage on, that it was that was far from the case. And what's really interesting is, you talk about photographs. What I've learned so much about my own life in my recovery, just from going back and looking at old family albums and old photographs, to see really how my life was playing out. And for all of us that are aware of, for example, the entire Pizzagate story that all of us have followed, there's a little girl that was brought to our attention who is the daughter of friends of James Alefantis. And her
supposedly.
Right. We don't, there are a lot of things that you're absolutely right, Howard. We don't know specifically all the details. However, we assume her name is Curious James. And I'm so struck when I look at some of the photographs of her, because I have photographs of myself at similar ages, and like the black circles under the eyes, and the looking just unhealthy and zombie like, and that was me. That's who I was in those family photographs. And then I look at my first abuser, my mother's second husband, in these photographs. And I see the story being laid out that in family photographs, where, normally you think of, you're at a family gathering, photographs are being taken, people are looking into the camera, or it's candid or whatever. But there's piles of photographs of him just staring at me, or focused on me, or photographs that were taken of me sleeping, and this and that, and it was just this obsession. And I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go finish. I thought you were done with
that. No, go ahead.
I just wanted, because you said earlier that, like growing up, that you thought you were the only one, and I guess at what point did you realize that you weren't the only one? And maybe do you remember the first time you actually told somebody, whether it was a friend or a teacher, or who, do you remember who you told?
Probably the first time I knew I wasn't the only one, and it was actually tangible, was around sixth grade. And I had made acquaintances with another girl that I went to school with. And she probably, in all honesty, at the time, we really had nothing in common. And she wouldn't have been someone that maybe I would have, I don't know, been socializing, if you will, with. However, somehow we ended up together and developed a friendship. But I would, when I first became aware, is I would go over and spend the night at her house, like on a weekend. And there were just things happening that were not right. And there were things that I could relate to that were not right. And to be honest with you, it was an unspoken understanding that we had. We never actually sat down and talked about it, but we both knew that we were both being abused. And so that was, again, that was probably the first time that I realized, wow, this is somebody else that,
that's really interesting.
Knows, some of the things maybe that I'm going through. And
you think you were drawn to each other, in some way? Like,
honestly, I mean, it's been so long and everything, but
sure.
I also believe, I believe the universe gives us what we need at the time when we need it. And
right.
So I think these things, happen. And if we're open to them and we're awake to them and we take it in and we're receptive, then it is what it is. That's something I've thought about over the years about how I, even as a child, my heart, when I wasn't around her, my heart broke for her because, I couldn't protect her. She couldn't protect herself. And even at that young age, my mission in life was always to take care of everybody else and nurture people. That's just how I was. When my brother was born, who is almost 6 years younger than I am, I can remember him waking up in the morning, and I would hear him across the hall in the nursery, and I would go over there and close the door. And I started teaching him as an infant to be very quiet, because I felt that if I could keep him controlled and quiet and happy and not making a fuss and everything, that he would be safer. It would be a safer environment for him. He actually, outside of the fact that the environment was always at a fever pitch, it was extremely violent and a scary place to be, he was not physically abused growing up. But again, it was such an abusive situation that he obviously, suffered in his own ways from just being in that environment. I know that you've had the honor and experience of having Becky on Traffic Report, and she's been kind enough to tell her story to everyone about how she was actually trafficked as a child. And I will tell you that while my experience was not that I was trafficked, I was put in a car and taken places and trafficked, I was trafficked in a way within my own home. And what I mean by that is that at the time, my mother's husband was a police officer, and we lived in a bedroom community of Cleveland, Ohio. And the police force that he was on, to this day, their reputation really has not changed. This particular police force was known for no nonsense. They basically played by their own rules, and that's just how it was. And they had absolutely no fear of reprisals or being held up to public scrutiny or anything else, which made them all extremely dangerous. And then you add in that you have people with super egos and that are violent and maybe alcoholic on top of that and all these things, and you have the perfect storm. And what started happening to me, the abuse started from the time I was 3, and within a relatively short period of time, I remember I started kindergarten at 4. So even before I started school, he started, he worked different shifts and whatnot at the time. And he would I'd be obviously in my room in bed asleep. He started bringing other men home.
Yeah,
and
V, that's traffic. You were trafficked, okay?
Yeah.
And people, I hope people realize that too.
Yes.
That you don't have to be taken across state lines. You
Right.
don't have to, be internationally, moved around. That
Right.
any child that is being abused by more than one abuser is being trafficked.
Yes. And it was, I remember in the beginning, it was a matter of, waking up and all I could smell was like alcohol and, people stumbling around and, in basic darkness and this, that, and the other thing. But then, there were times where, for example, our mailman was there in uniform because, he'd come from the bar or this or that. And, as a child, you do what you have to protect yourself. And the brain is an amazing organ. And, the brain has a way of taking you out of body when you need to be, and things like that. I learned how to stay awake from all of this. I learned how to stay awake all night. And because I thought if I stayed awake all night, I would be safer. It would keep me safer. Which really doesn't make any sense because you're a defenseless child. But in my child's mind, that made sense to me, that if I'm alert and I'm awake, I will be able to control my environment. Well, of course, that wasn't true.
So your mother got remarried when you were 3?
That's correct.
So how long after they got married did the abuse start?
It started like the physical abuse, emotional abuse, everything that started like immediately, which is not, with my mother and myself, which is not unusual in domestic violence situations. There's a lot of data on, men, for example, that until that marriage certificate is signed, they may seem like the most charming person in the world, this, that, and the other thing. And then all of a sudden, if they're an abusive person, they come into this place where, well, now I own her. She's mine. She's my property. Sure. And now I can do whatever I want. I own this person.
Right. Do you remember him before they got married?
No, not really. Not really. Okay. Because my mother and I were living with my grandparents before they got married. My mother did not want to marry him. He hated my biological father. There were all these things going on. So I think, it was like I represented the fact that my mother, who was supposed to marry him to begin with, while he was away in the service, ended up marrying my father. And so there were all these dynamics going on that I think fueled his rage and everything else.
Do you think your mom knew what was going on?
To this day, when I finally confronted her with all of it, which didn't happen until, my goodness, probably the first time I tried talking to her about it, I was in oh my goodness, might have been even my early 50s, believe it or not. And, to this day, she has absolutely no knowledge of anything. She, honestly, in the beginning, it was really difficult for me when I first started talking to her about it because she was kind of victimizing me all over again. Like, basically, like, this isn't true. You made this up. All these things. And this happens to people all the time. And so here you are, you're trying to reach out for some type of understanding or awareness and even just to be heard. And then, you're beaten right back down. And I know this happens to a lot of us. And so that constant, you're constantly being re-victimized, which is so unfortunate. The only time I remember in childhood, again, it was around that age of like 6th grade, where I ever went to try to seek help I went to a counselor at school. And, to this day, I remember, I don't remember every detail of it, but I remember the experience. And the counselor, I didn't feel the counselor was mean or cruel in any way. But I went to this counselor and tried, gosh, it was like probably pouring out of me and putting my story out there. And I was absolutely told that, basically patted on the head and, well, everything's going to be okay. And, families have their problems and this and that. And everything gets swept under the rug. And that was it. And I mean, it wasn't like they called children's services or anybody ever knew anything. And I mean,
just for historical perspective, that would have been
it would have been, let's see, I would have been 10. So it would have been probably around 1970, 69, 70.
Yeah.
71.
Yeah.
Okay. And obviously they knew who your stepfather was.
Well, at that time, he had ceased being a police officer. And so He actually was working for a Fortune 200 company. And, and this is a guy too, that on the church we belonged to that I grew up in, whenever our minister would travel or go on vacation, he was up there in the pulpit preaching. So, I had to sit in the congregation and look up at him and think, what the hell?
Wow.
It's we're sitting here in church and this guy's up there and he's got everybody in his hands, because everybody loved him and thought he was amazing. My parents he adopted me when I was in kindergarten, legally adopted me. And my parents throughout the years, they were head of the PTA. They were head of the youth group in church. They were, you name it, they were doing it. And so on the outside, it looked like, Ozzie and Harriet.
Yeah,
that's before my time.
What I was going to ask you, too, yeah, I was going to ask you too, because the what I found in some of the research is that they have these Masonic, especially with the police, and I know they do in the United States, but even more so in the UK. And these Masonic relationships that they have serve as like a communication line to traffic kids. They serve as protection for the individuals involved. Did you notice anything like that, or do you?
That I can't say. I just knew. I just knew that he was a very dangerous person, and I knew that. I knew as a child, and even as I started getting a little bit older, I knew that, if I ever tried to go against him or do anything, he would kill me. That was my perspective. He would kill me. I was always living in fear of him killing my mother and that I would be stuck with him. And then what would become of me? I started taking care of my brother at a very young age. I became his surrogate mother in a lot of ways. My mother, she and I have a relationship now, but at the time the sun rose and set in my mother for me. And my mother was and is a total narcissist. Her husband was as well. And it was, all about them. However, she didn't have the control that he had in the relationship. But as I got older, I would see the shift of power, and I would see her push the envelope with him. But what happened to me as a child as well is that she was so angry about, having to get married young, not because she was pregnant. It was just something forced upon her with my grandmother, she was also a survivor herself. so it was like a really bizarre situation. My grandmother kind of lived vicariously through my mother, who was a really beautiful woman. And so there was all this control going on. And my mother just expected to be treated as a princess and whatnot. And my mother was so unhappy about having to be a parent and have a child. And she felt like her life had been ruined, that when her husband would come home from work or whatever, she would bend his ear. And I don't know to this day if it was to protect her from being beaten and her from going through the things she was going through, but I was the one that was offered up as the sacrifice. And he had rituals of, things that he did with me, to humiliate me and, very depraved ritualistic things that he would do before he would beat me, very systematic things. He would beat my pets. He would take my, like our dog into another room. And I always, I love animals and people. And, I would hear my pets screaming in agony and things like that. Those are things that he did to me, to control me and hurt me. And so it was just, it was a constant 24/7 living in fear, waiting for the other shoe to drop. You might have a few hours or a day that seemed normal or, oh, dare we say happy or something, but you knew that was never going to last. But then, survival kicks in and you tell yourself, oh, well, maybe things are going to get better. Maybe everything's going to change. There's going to be a miracle, and, but
that's got to be how you got through it. I mean, my God, I mean, how else, can you keep going? And
mm-hmm.
Something that was really interesting that you brought up, though, I've seen this too through the research, is the multi-generational aspects of this.
Yeah.
And he learned whatever he did, he learned it somewhere.
Well, he did his. I do know his history was that his father was an alcoholic, as he was, and his biological father beat all of them growing up. And, to this day, there are certain things people take to the grave with them because he's no longer alive. But I remember him telling me probably around the time I was like maybe 10, I don't even know what the reason was, but this is something that's all stayed with me throughout my life. And I remember him saying in a moment to me that something had happened to him growing up that turned him, and his words almost verbatim were, turned him against his parents, and that he never wanted me to go through what he did, about how, he turned on his parents and this and that. And I remember standing there thinking, you've got to be kidding, because what else could there, like, you don't think that I already hate you, or, you know what I mean? It was like, but then, this idea of Stockholm syndrome and what we know now through the literature and through science is so true, because I can tell you that there were times when my mother was basically kind of checked out, that and I'm taking care of my brother, and I'm, trying to keep it together in my mind. And the idea that, something would happen and, we'd be left to our own devices, and we would have no money, and we'd be out on the street, because all these things were threatened all the time, And so I lived in mortal fear of us being like, literally like street people, out on the street. And he would take me, he would take me in a squad car when I was young. He used to love to take me down to the jail and stuff, and put me like in, behind bars and, stuff to scare me and all these crazy things.
Yeah, it's the dynamic that you're describing, though. It just seems so familiar, because I have a lot of experience in the addiction end of this, and it seems like it's really very similar. Like, your grandma was a survivor too, and then mom going out and finding an abuser, and it just with just say for substance abuse, for example, they they if their father's alcoholic, they go out and they marry an alcoholic. I mean, without recovery, it's just like a self-fulfilling, repeating, prophecy until somebody breaks the chain. Which
you're 100% correct, John, because I've been through that in my own adult life where I didn't make good decisions. Like when I married and was going to have children and everything, I didn't make good decisions. I had, as I got, when I did become an adult, I know that there were, men that passed through my life that were quote unquote good, seemed to be good people, but in all honesty, they just seemed like they seemed weak to me. And my perception was that I'm damaged, I'm damaged goods. And I, how can I be with this nice person that wants to take care of me because I'm horrible. I'm like, oh, if they ever find out who I really am, they're going to be mortified and all of these things. So it just seemed, it was like the chaos is what I knew. That was familiar. And so going right back into that environment, even though I swore up and down for years that there's no way in the world I would ever marry someone like this or get involved in this type of situation, but it happens. And
we saw too the way the social engineering has been instituted, and for decades and decades and decades, what it does is it freezes the child as a child, even if they're not victims of sexual abuse or physical abuse, but that the social engineering that they're using on these kids through the schools and what they're taught and the television and now YouTube, that's what it does. It freezes their mentality at a very young age, and then how you can't expect that person to make decisions as an adult, good decisions, and it's so just insidious and like beyond evil,
Well, you doubt yourself at every turn, because every time you go to make a decision, even if, in the moment, if I was going to make a decision about something, even though I, had vetted my intentions and researched something or whatever, and I'm making this decision, I felt really good about it. Then those voices come up in the back of your mind, and those old tapes start playing in your head, saying, "What, are you kidding me? Well, you're going to be a complete failure. People are going to laugh at you. People, I went through my childhood and into adulthood believing that every time I walked into a room, I had a scarlet letter on me, and that it was visible, and that everyone that I encountered knew that I was damaged goods." And that's real. That was my truth and my reality. And
was there a progression in the abuse? So I mean, obviously I don't actually even know how long it lasted with your stepmother.
Actually, the sexual abuse, what I see now, the pattern of, is that as I started getting older, once I started to hit puberty, and my body started to change, it was like that would be probably the marker for when there was no interest for him there anymore. And
okay.
Yeah, I mean that's my perspective, that he, it was like I wasn't this little child anymore, and he wanted me to be a child. And then what happened is all the other abuses started to manifest and escalate more. And on top of that, he was, he was grooming me for, here I am, this young girl, and, you're at an age in school where, boys and girls are starting to interact and things like that. And, I'm coming home from school and, he's calling me a whore and a slut. And, so this is then how things went, that I was disgusting and I was terrible. And he was always accusing me of things. And, so it's like your mind is constantly being fractured all over the place. There's just, you can't make sense of any of these things that are happening because there's no logic to any of it in your mind. And you don't understand, I used to, in my child's mind, I would say, I'm not a bad person. I'm not, I'm a good person. I love people. I love, I would never hurt anybody. I don't understand why these things are happening. I just can't understand it. And I'll be honest with you, at 57, I still don't understand it. I mean, I may understand it somewhat from, I spent years in psychiatric social work and, so maybe scientifically I understand some of it, but I'll tell you what, my brain, your brains, we're not wired to completely understand this. I mean, I firmly believe that because there is just no way we can wrap our heads around what these people do.
No.
And there's no remorse. There's no, there's just nothing. I mean, I never got an apology. I never got, years later, oh, well, I'm sorry for, what happened when you were growing up and I was mean and all these things.
Did you actually confront him on this?
Did I?
As an adult?
In all honesty, no. And once I was an adult and had not seen him in years, the next time I saw him is actually when my brother got married, and I don't even know how many years it had been since I'd seen him. And the very first thing he did when he walked up to me, I think we were like at the rehearsal dinner or something. When he walked up to me, was he started commenting about my body. And I'm just like, but by that time, I was just like looking at him like, get the fuck away from me, basically. It was like, turn around, keep walking. And I had the self-awareness that, I already had 2 children by this time. Okay. I was a parent. I had 2 children of my own. But I had a sense of this guy cannot hurt me anymore. If this guy tried to do anything or even went near my kids, I would take him out. So it was a whole different perspective on the situation.
Did he stay married to your mother?
No, they divorced when I was 14.
Oh, okay.
They divorced when I was 14. She finally got up the courage to divorce. And it was a good thing that she had because, as I'm sure you guys know, that in domestic violence situations, everything, it continues to escalate. Rarely do you see situations where things turn around or people go into therapy or, things end up taking a huge turn for the better. And things were getting to the point where he was so obsessed with her and wanted to control her that his plan was, and he would come and talk to me about this, that there was a period of time where he was talking to me privately, telling me that she was becoming more and more ill mentally. And both my mother and I, like, from the time I was in 6th grade or around that time, my mother and I were both prescribed Valium, from our doctor, because, we were like basket cases, and so he was using all this stuff, and now we know, they don't even prescribe Valium, rarely anymore, because, Valium, it zones you out. Well, my mom's zoning out on Valium, and he's telling me, well, she's been becoming increasingly ill for a long time. And he would talk about like the sanitariums that he was looking at, that he was going to have her committed and this and that. And I mean, which was another nightmare, because I'm like, how am I going to take care of my brother? And my mother's not going to be here anymore. And so
it was still when you were about 13, 14, he's running these.
Exactly. Oh yeah. I mean, and he traveled and everything in for his position, and like he would come home from being gone like 3 or 4 days, and I remember times where he'd come into the house, and around this time frame, he'd come in the house and he'd be smashed, and I remember that our dog had passed away that we'd had like up, for like 11, almost 12 years that I grew up with and everything else. And we had rescued a dog that was abandoned, and we rescued this dog. And, for example, he came in from being out of town, and he comes upstairs and walks in the kitchen, took my mom and I by surprise. We didn't know he was home. And I was, bending down, doing something, I don't know, putting something in the oven. He pulled me up by my hair, and then, and my mother started to say something to him. And then, he started, smacking her and me, and he picked up my dog, this puppy, and threw this dog, my puppy all the way across the room. I mean, like kitchen into the breakfast area. And the dog slammed against the wall and down the wall and on the floor. And I mean, so the violence just continued to escalate.
Can I, one question I have, do you have any idea how he went from being a police officer to working for a Fortune 200 company?
Yes.
It just seems like an odd, okay.
It is completely odd, Howard. And it was because my mother drove him. He was, the honest truth was, if he had been able to stay a police officer the rest of his life till he died, that would have been his calling, and that was the perfect place for him with his personality and everything else. My mother was embarrassed that he was a police officer because she thought it was beneath her. And so she was constantly like on him to do something bigger and better, bigger and better, and bigger and better. And, so she drove him. And this is why I say this was this codependency that these two had.
That's interesting, because you're saying like he's this monster, but at the same time, he's.
Yes. And she would like endure the beatings and, offered me up to him and everything else. But as long as she was getting, as long as we kept getting a bigger and better house, and bigger and better cars, and she had the perfect wardrobe, and everything looked perfect on the outside, that was her, where she wanted to be, and that was her survival. I'm sorry, go ahead.
But what I'm saying is, maybe, this is, maybe 40, more than 40 years ago, but, in today's world, a police officer just doesn't leave his job and jump into a Fortune 200 company.
Well,
so
how
did he
at this point in time, and you have to realize, this was years ago and everything. So he actually went, went like to a headhunter, and was applying for jobs. He had interviews. This particular job he ended up taking, he was flown out of state, to their corporate headquarters, and he was put through all the paces, and they did all the psychological testing and profiling. A lot of good that does. Or in order to be in these jobs, do you need to have this type of mentality? I don't know, which came first. But so he ended up, getting this position, and did extremely well. Was very good at it. Was a tremendous provider financially.
My conspiratorial mind was just leading to, was there some type of trafficking? Was he involved in a company, and did his
quid pro quo something? of that nature.
Right.
In all honesty, I don't believe that. No.
Okay.
I do to this day wonder, though, all of the positions that they held in school, in church, everything, and I'll never know. But but he had such access to kids. I mean,
Children.
and even like our church, I mean, a lot of the kids that were in our church were kids I went to school with. You know what I mean? And
Right.
they would have weekend, and I was actually the youth group that they were in charge of for the church. The kids were actually older than I was at the time. So like that wasn't, I wasn't even a part of that group. But they would have like weekend, they would spend weekends at the church where the kids would bring their sleeping bags and they'd stay there and live there. And of course, at church, they had a kitchen and all this jazz and everything. They would take them on trips out of state, out of town.
That doesn't sound good.
Yeah.
No.
So, I mean, this is just how it was while I was growing up.
Yeah. And when you do some of this research too, that's what, I mean, it's
well, I know.
They're all interrelated. They're, either through secret societies or business or small town, whatever it is, they're it's like a sick underground organization,
Mm-hmm. Well, I can remember my mom telling me a story as I'd, gotten a little bit older, and she and I would have conversations about him, about his violence and everything else. And I can remember her telling me about, stories about when he was on the police force and how just nefarious they were. I mean, they were thick as thieves, and like I said, their reputation was, you did not cross these guys. I mean, if you got pulled over in this particular city, it was like, yes, officer, no officer, or you better know somebody, because they were involved in all kinds of stuff. And a lot of them were drinkers. They were gamblers. I mean, they were involved in a lot of activities together. They hung together. But I remember my mom telling me, for example, that when they would have to preside like over funerals and things like that, where they'd have to, you have a funeral procession, this, that, and the other. And I remember my mom saying one of the things that the police wives used to drive them crazy is that the husbands never ever bought them flowers, because they always would bring flowers from the graves of people home to them, bouquets. And it was like, I remember her telling me that, and I remember feeling sick to my stomach, because I thought that was the most depraved thing in that moment I'd ever heard. I mean, it just bothered me.
Depraved. When you said your stepfather was bringing men around the house, were they other police officers also?
Yes. Well, and there were times where I can tell you, like his personal best friend, who was not a police officer, they'd known each other for years and everything. In the very beginning, it was like the two of them. And I can remember, it was like, what were these two doing? Like my parents would be socializing. They'd have company over. Everybody's downstairs. But meanwhile, her husband and his best friend are upstairs with me, bathing me, doing all these things. And I'm not going to go into all the detail of the things that were done to me. But this is how it went. Now, meanwhile, as a child,
so company's downstairs and they're upstairs with you.
Downstairs, and all this is going on, and in my mind as a child, I'm going like, "Where's my mother?" I was always in my mind saying, "Where's my mother? Where's my mother? My mother's never here. She's never here."
Yeah. And truthfully, in the research too, and I think the society and this whole problem has just gotten so much worse through like probably the 60s, but the awareness level, was not even there. I mean,
no. And I will tell you that my mother was not. My mother had not been sexually abused as a child. She had not been abused at all, other than things that go on in childhood that, we all have our traumas in childhood, and, this, that, and the other thing. And, she has her own crosses to bear as far as things that upset her as a child that to this day she hasn't been able to let go of. But the fact of the matter is she was very loved and wanted by especially her grandparents and everything. So who lived with, both families kind of lived together.
But her mom was a victim.
My grandmother, my great grandfather actually was a engineer and very talented. But in way back in that era, they had a horrible flu that came through Ohio, and my grandmother and her brother had already been born. And my grandfather was actually one of the first engineers that designed like the very first electric streetcars and things like that. So he went through Case Western Reserve University like in 3 years, the engineering program. He's a very brilliant man. And so I've looked up the records of this flu, and he was killed during that. And then my grandmother or my great grandmother was very young, and she just kind of gave up. And she ended up taking my grandmother and her brother to the church, the Methodist church, and had them adopted out. And my grandmother was adopted by, it was two sisters that took the kids, and they were separated. They were actually raised as cousins. And the people that adopted my grandmother were horrifically, just beasts. And my grandmother was sexually abused by the minister of the church, along with other people, and just, suffered torturous, ritualistic, horrible behaviors. Bizarre things they made her kneel on raw rice on wooden floor.
Oh my God, that's my ex-wife's story. That must have been a thing.
Like hours at a time. Just depraved behaviors, you know, and
V, we're getting towards
the
end
of yeah.
Time always catches up with us.
Yes, it does.
Yeah, we'll be back Thursday so we can continue. It's just hard. You don't want to get caught. We always get caught like in the middle of the thought.
Yes, I know.
But what a chilling and it's an incredible portrait of what a child goes through, because you see the news stories, you see the statistics, you watch videos, and until you hear what it actually is going on from somebody who's been through it, there's just nothing that can really break through all that dissonance that people have about the subject. So I just thank you so much for having the courage to bring that out into the open. And I know you've helped anybody that's going through this right now, anybody that's thinking about whether they need to tell somebody. And so I'm just awed at your story.
We need to stand together. There's power in numbers, and that's my prayer that we can all rise up together and really take control of what's happening to our children.
Can I plug my hashtag real quick?
Yes, please do.
Because I've been trying to for 3 shows.
It's very important.
Right. Pedogate News, hashtag Pedogate News on Twitter. And you'll find plenty of articles about exactly what we're talking about. And I almost need it.
Thank you, Hal. Thank you, V.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Part 2. Stay on the line.